It started as an impulse decision, one of those spur-of-the-moment ideas that feel like genius at the time. I was restless, bored of my daily grind in the city, and desperate for something, anything, to shake me from my routine. That's how I ended up in the Pine Hollow forest with nothing but a backpack, a cheap tent, and the misguided confidence that I could handle a weekend of solo hiking. Pine Hollow wasn't a tourist hotspot. It was an expansive, dense forest with miles of trails crisscrossing through it, but it was far from a well-maintained national park. The kind of place you'd find on an obscure blog post titled, "Hidden Gems for True Adventurers." That sounded perfect to me at the time. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. The first day went by uneventfully. I parked my car at the edge of the designated camping area and set off with a printed map and a GPS app on my phone. The trees were beautiful, tall pines that swayed gently in the wind, their needles carpeting the ground in a soft, fragrant layer. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't entirely alone, even if I hadn't seen another human since I arrived. By evening, I found a clearing near a small stream and set up my tent. I felt accomplished, proud even. It was a quiet, peaceful night. I cooked instant noodles on my portable stove, listened to the sounds of the forest, and fell asleep under a blanket of stars. The next morning, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the weight and rhythm were unmistakably human. My heart jumped, and I froze, listening intently. The footsteps circled my tent, slow and deliberate, crunching the pine needles underfoot. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited, holding my breath, but no one responded. After what felt like an eternity, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. There was no one there. The clearing was empty, the forest still and quiet. I stepped out, scanning the area, but saw no sign of anyone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was an animal, after all. I tried to shake off the unease and packed up my camp. The plan was to hike deeper into the forest and spend another night before heading back to my car. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap or the rustle of leaves, and I'd whip around, only to find nothing. The forest, which had seemed so inviting the day before, now felt oppressive, the towering pines casting long, dark shadows. By midday, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. A campsite. But it wasn't like mine. This one was a mess. The tent was slashed open, its contents strewn across the ground. Clothes, a sleeping bag, and food wrappers were scattered everywhere. The fire pit was cold, and there was no sign of the camper. I stood there, staring at the wreckage, when I noticed something carved into one of the trees. A single word. "Leave." I felt a chill run down my spine. This was no ordinary animal attack. Someone had done this, someone who didn't want others in their forest. "Okay," I muttered to myself, backing away. "Time to go." I turned and started retracing my steps, heading back the way I came. But the unease only grew. The forest seemed unfamiliar, the trails blending together. I checked my map and GPS, but neither seemed to align with what I was seeing. It was as if the forest had shifted overnight, the paths twisting and turning to confuse me. By late afternoon, I was completely lost. Panic started to set in. The sun was sinking lower, and I knew I didn't want to be out here after dark. I quickened my pace, hoping to find something, a landmark, a familiar trail, anything. That's when I saw him. He was standing in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. A man in dark clothing, his face hidden by a hood. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped behind a tree and disappeared from sight. My heart was pounding as I approached the spot where he'd been standing. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no trail, nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I'll admit it, I started to run. My instincts were screaming at me to get out, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever was happening in this forest. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. Night fell, and I was forced to stop. Exhausted and terrified, I found a spot to huddle under a tree, too afraid to set up my tent. I didn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow, felt like a threat. And then I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling around me. I gripped the small camping knife I'd brought, my only weapon, and held my breath. The footsteps stopped, and then I heard a low, raspy voice. "You should have left." I didn't wait to see who it was. I bolted, running blindly through the forest, branches slashing at my face and arms. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps fast and heavy, closing the distance. Somehow, I managed to lose him. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my lungs were burning, and my legs felt like jelly. I collapsed against a tree, struggling to catch my breath. That's when I saw the light. A faint glow in the distance. Hope surged through me as I stumbled toward it, thinking it might be a ranger station or another camper. But as I got closer, I realized it was neither. It was a cabin. Old and decrepit, its windows boarded up, but light was seeping through the cracks. I hesitated, the rational part of my brain screaming at me to stay away, but desperation won out. I knocked on the door. "Please, I need help," I called out. The door creaked open, but no one was there. The inside was dimly lit by an oil lamp on a table. The walls were covered in photographs, all of them of people. Hikers, campers, families. Some were smiling, others looked nervous, but all of them had one thing in common: their eyes were scratched out. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, but before I could leave, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around to see the man standing there, his face finally visible. It was expressionless, cold, and utterly devoid of humanity. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, stepping toward me. I panicked, lashing out with the knife, but he was fast. He grabbed my wrist, twisting it until I dropped the blade. I fought back, kicking and struggling, but he was stronger. He shoved me to the ground and raised a heavy object, a hammer, above his head. In that moment, I thought I was going to die. But then, a blinding light filled the room, followed by shouting, "Drop it! Hands in the air!" It was the Rangers. They burst into the cabin, weapons drawn, and tackled the man to the ground. I lay there, shaking, as they restrained him and checked to see if I was okay. Apparently, he'd been on their radar for years, a recluse who lived in the forest and had a history of violent confrontations with trespassers. They'd been searching for him after discovering the wrecked campsite I'd stumbled upon. They escorted me back to safety, and the man was taken into custody. I gave a statement, but I didn't stick around to learn what happened to him. I just wanted to leave that place and never look back. Now, whenever I hear someone talk about solo hiking or finding hidden gems, I can't help but shudder. The forest might be beautiful, but it's also vast, wild, and unforgiving. And sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones you expect to find. The weekend promised an escape, a chance to breathe fresh air, away from the endless noise and concrete monotony of the city. Pine Hollow Forest had been on my list for a while, a place I'd read about in obscure forums that praised its untouched beauty and solitude. No bustling tourists, no traffic, just miles of trails and towering trees. It sounded perfect. I arrived mid-morning, my car kicking up dust as I pulled into a small gravel lot at the forest's edge. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead. A wooden sign marked the entrance to the trail. "Welcome to Pine Hollow Forest. Explore responsibly." Below it hung a smaller, faded plaque warning hikers to stay on marked paths. It felt almost quaint, like a relic from another time. With a map tucked into my back pocket, and my gear slung over one shoulder, I set off, eager to leave behind the hum of civilization. The trailhead greeted me with soft earth and scattered pine needles, the kind of ground that muted footsteps and made everything feel quieter. Birds chirped in the canopy above, and sunlight filtered through the dense foliage in golden streaks. It was the kind of scene that could belong on a postcard. The hike started easy, the path wide and well-trodden. I'd chosen a route that looped deep into the forest and circled back to the lot. According to my map, it would take about 3 hours at a steady pace, but I wasn't in a rush. I wanted to take my time, to soak in the serenity. Occasionally, I'd stop to admire a cluster of wildflowers or the way moss blanketed the base of a tree. The forest felt alive, vibrant in a way the city never could be. An hour in, the trail narrowed, twisting and climbing gently through the hills. The trees grew denser here, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches forming a canopy so tight that only slivers of sunlight broke through. The air was cooler, tinged with the faint smell of decay from the rich, damp soil. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But as I rounded a bend, something shifted. The forest, once inviting and warm, felt different. The chirping birds fell silent, and the breeze that had been a constant companion seemed to vanish. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the path, and the faint rustle of leaves above. It was subtle, but the energy had changed, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the unease and pressed on, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I'd come here for solitude, hadn't I? This was what I wanted, isolation, quiet. Yet as I walked, the feeling of being watched began to creep in, slow and insidious. I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, but the trail behind me was always empty. By the time I stopped for lunch, the unease had settled into a dull thrum at the back of my mind. I found a spot near a shallow creek and sat on a fallen log, pulling out a sandwich from my pack. The sound of water trickling over stones was soothing, and for a moment, I let myself relax. Maybe I was overthinking things. Forests were supposed to feel different, weren't they? That was the point. As I ate, I noticed something unusual in the distance. About 20 yards away, on the other side of the creek, a tree had fallen recently. Its roots jutted out of the ground, tangled and raw, exposing a patch of earth that seemed unnaturally dark. Around the base of the tree were footprints, large ones, too wide to be mine, pressed deep into the soil. They led away from the creek and disappeared into the shadows of the forest. My appetite vanished. I stood, wiping my hands on my pants, and crossed the creek for a closer look. The prints were fresh, the edges crisp. Whoever had made them couldn't have been far. I scanned the trees, but the forest was still. Too still. A sound broke the silence, a soft crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. It came from somewhere to my left. I turned sharply, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. There was no response, just the oppressive quiet. I stayed frozen for a moment, every nerve on edge, before convincing myself to move. The unease was back, stronger now, coiling in my chest like a living thing. I decided to cut my hike short. The loop could wait for another day. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get back to the safety of my car. I turned around, retracing my steps, but the trail looked different. The landmarks I'd noted earlier were gone, replaced by unfamiliar trees and rocks. Panic bubbled up as I checked my map, then my GPS. Neither made sense. The app showed me veering off the trail, but that couldn't be right. I'd followed the path exactly. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees pressing closer, their shadows longer and darker. My breathing grew shallow as I pushed forward, hoping to find something familiar. And then I saw it. A figure. Just ahead, partially obscured by the trees. It was a man, standing perfectly still, his face hidden by the shadows. He wore dark clothing, and something about his posture made my skin crawl. I froze, my mind racing. Should I call out? Run? Before I could decide, he turned and disappeared into the forest, moving silently, like a ghost. Fear took over. I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the earth as I fled in the direction I thought would lead me back. The forest blurred around me, the trees all looking the same, their branches clawing at me as I passed. I didn't stop until I tripped over a root and fell hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy aroma of pine and moss as I stepped out of my car. Pine Hollow Forest stretched before me, its dense canopy shrouding the morning sun in a greenish haze. I'd heard about this place through whispers, forums dedicated to hidden trails and untouched wilderness. It wasn't a tourist hotspot, and that's exactly what drew me to it. A slice of isolation, far from the city's ceaseless hum, was all I wanted. The gravel crunched underfoot as I adjusted my backpack and approached the wooden sign marking the entrance. "Welcome to Pine Hollow Forest. Explore responsibly," it read. Beneath it, a smaller plaque, worn and faded, warned hikers to stay on designated paths. I paused, letting the quiet settle around me. No honking cars, no chatter, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I set off at an easy pace, the trail welcoming me with a soft carpet of pine needles. The forest seemed alive, buzzing faintly with birdsong and the chatter of unseen creatures. Every so often, I'd stop to admire the scenery, a patch of vibrant wildflowers here, a moss-covered log there. It felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by time. The first hour of the hike was idyllic. The trail was well-trodden, winding gently through the trees. My map promised a loop that would bring me back to the parking lot in about 3 hours. I wasn't in a rush, though. I'd packed snacks, water, and a small first aid kit. It was supposed to be a day of peace, a chance to reconnect with nature. As the trail narrowed, the atmosphere began to shift. The cheerful bird calls faded, replaced by a heavy silence. The air felt cooler, damp even, and the trees grew closer together, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. I told myself it was natural, forests had their moods, after all. But a faint unease began to creep in. Stopping to check my map, I realized I'd reached a fork in the trail. The map wasn't clear about which path to take. One was wide and well-maintained, while the other was barely more than a deer track. Something about the narrower path intrigued me. It felt, less traveled, like it held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Ignoring the faint warning tug in my gut, I chose the narrower path. The further I went, the more the forest seemed to close in. The underbrush thickened, and the air grew heavier. My footsteps, once muffled by the soft ground, now seemed to echo unnaturally. I paused to drink some water, scanning the woods around me. There was no sign of other hikers, no distant voices or laughter. For the first time, the solitude didn't feel comforting. It felt oppressive. I pressed on, telling myself it was all in my head. The trail twisted and turned, leading me to a small clearing. It was the first open space I'd seen in a while, and I decided it was a good place to take a break. Sitting on a fallen log, I pulled out a protein bar and my water bottle. The sunlight, filtered through the canopy, dappled the ground in shifting patterns. For a moment, I felt at ease again. That's when I noticed it, a cluster of objects at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the underbrush. Curious, I walked over. There was an old fire pit, surrounded by scattered debris, a rusted tin can, a tattered piece of cloth, and what looked like the broken handle of a knife. The sight was unsettling. It wasn't unusual to find remnants of old campsites in the woods, but this one felt wrong. Abandoned in a hurry, maybe. The knife handle was clean, its edges smooth as if it hadn't been there long. A sharp crack broke the silence, like a twig snapping underfoot. I froze, every muscle tensing. The sound had come from the trees behind me. Slowly, I turned, scanning the dense foliage. At first, I saw nothing, just the endless maze of trunks and shadows. But then, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A figure dark and indistinct, slipped between the trees and vanished. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The forest swallowed the sound, offering no reply. My pulse quickened as I backed away from the clearing, clutching the knife handle like it was some kind of talisman. The uneasy feeling from earlier surged back, stronger than before. Something about this place felt wrong now. Hostile, even. I decided to head back, retracing my steps. Or at least I tried to. The trail seemed different. Landmarks I'd noted earlier, a fallen tree, a cluster of wildflowers, were nowhere to be seen. Panic began to bubble up as I realized I might be lost. My map was no help. It seemed like I'd veered off the marked trail entirely. The GPS on my phone was equally useless, its signal flickering in and out. The sense of being watched grew stronger with every step. I glanced over my shoulder repeatedly, convinced I'd see someone, or something, following me. Once I thought I heard footsteps, but when I stopped to listen, the forest was silent. My breathing grew shallow, my chest tight with fear. As the hours stretched on, the sun dipped lower, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The idea of being stuck out here after dark was unbearable. I quickened my pace, driven by sheer desperation. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I stumbled upon it, a small cabin, nestled among the trees like something out of a grim fairy tale. It was old, its wooden walls weathered and darkened by time. The windows were smeared with grime, making it impossible to see inside. A part of me wanted to turn and run, but another part, the part desperate for safety, urged me forward. Maybe someone was inside. Maybe they could help. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I approached the door. My knuckles rapped against the wood, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Hello? Is anyone there?" No answer. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. It swung inward with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a rickety table, a single chair, a rusted stove, and a cot with a thin, stained mattress. Papers littered the floor, their edges yellowed with age. On the table sat a lantern and a small notebook. I picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. The handwriting was erratic, the words barely legible in places. Most of it seemed like ramblings about the forest, warnings to stay away. One entry stood out. "He watches. He waits. He knows when you're alone." A noise from outside made me drop the notebook. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and drawing closer. My heart thundered as I peeked out the grimy window. A man stood just beyond the clearing, his face obscured by a hood. He didn't move, didn't call out. He just stood there, watching. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the lantern and bolted for the back door, crashing into the forest. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I stumbled onto another trail, one that looked familiar. Relief surged through me as I realized I was close to the parking lot. But the relief was short-lived. Behind me, I heard him again, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps, faster now, closing the gap. My car came into view, and I sprinted the final stretch, fumbling with my keys. As I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors, I saw him at the edge of the lot. He stood there, his hood pulled back to reveal a face that was unsettlingly calm. Our eyes met for a brief moment before he turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. The engine roared to life, and I sped out of the lot, my hands trembling on the wheel. Even as I left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, a shadowy presence lingering in my mind. It wasn't until I reached the safety of my apartment that I realized I was still holding the knife handle. The forest may have let me go, but something told me it wasn't finished with me yet. Hey everyone, thank you so much for supporting this channel. It truly means a lot. As a broke college student editing all my videos on an Android phone, it takes a lot of effort to bring these stories to life. A laptop would help me create better content faster, so if you enjoy my work, please subscribe and share. Your support makes all the difference. Thank you so much.